Is cash really king? Tune in to find out. In today's episode, we explore the merits, the pros and cons of cash. In the last episode, we looked at what is an emergency live broadcast where we looked at the British pound, which was the proposal that's been put forward by the central bank to launch the UK central bank digital currency. So we took time in the last episode to unravel the consultation and shared some resources to help submit a response to that consultation, and over 50,000 responses were shared. We can't take all the credit for that, but we played our part. And it's clear that there's a strong message that people want to preserve cash and resist central bank digital currencies. And it's very clear that there is more thinking to be undertaken around what a central bank digital currency should or could look like in the future. But in this episode, we're going to talk about cash. You know, the message was loud and clear. GB News have recently launched their Save Cash campaign. So we're going to look at cash as an asset and explore in the context of things like emerging assets like Bitcoin and digital assets, and see what role cash plays, what it can play, and what these emerging assets can do alongside cash. So Sam, an important subject that we're going to tackle today.
Absolutely, Dan, and it's always much more nuanced than just the very simple binaries that we often see. You know, the kind of very much I'm pro this, I'm anti that, and we always like to look at the pros and cons of everything, because they all got different qualities, they've got different use cases, and it's just not that simple. And I always say, you know, in a non-negative way, there is no panacea answer, but I think it's important to weigh them up and look at as many perspectives and angles so you get a real holistic picture, because we just see so many oversimplified kind of viewpoints that, and again, some of it's just because people aren't aware of some of the nuances or the history of certain assets or how they're controlled or what qualities they have. So by shining a light on them, as always, we want to give a bigger picture and a bigger kind of overview of the pros and cons of each kind of asset and the hows and whys of them.
Definitely. I think this episode will make people think differently about cash. One of the biggest observations I get from the content that we've done, particularly on crypto, Sam, whether we're talking about Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, altcoins, blockchain, is that a fear that comes up that cash will be lost in the presence of these assets. And I think that's a valid fear. You know, we are seeing an increasing digitized world. We're seeing the emergence of central bank digital currencies. And if you haven't seen our episode on that yet, where we actually show you the global map showing how far advanced these things are, it's quite clear that this is something that's progressing fast. So quite rightly, there is concerns about losing cash, and we'll dive into some of those concerns. But I don't think they are necessarily mutually exclusive.
No.
I don't think we need to think about cash as a threat to or these emerging assets as a threat to cash. I think they can be very much complementary. So we'll unravel that as well today. So
yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, Dan. That often you get this very simplified, well, I don't like that. We mustn't get involved in that because I want this. And again, I was talking about diversifying and having more tools and understanding the different tools. So really, and we'll get more into it, you know, something like Bitcoin wasn't created to go against cash. It's responding to the fiat system, not to cash, which is part of the fiat system. And we'll get into that, which is, you know, where does it stand within the fiat system, but understand it is in that fiat system. So Bitcoin was not developed to, you know, replace it, or you know, that wasn't the issue. It's the issue of the fiat system as a whole. So I think that distinction is really important.
Yeah, the two big things that come up for me when I see the kind of objections to or where people are saying that seeing these digital assets as a threat to cash is the potential erosion of the privacy that cash offers. But not just the privacy, of course. You know, when you're trading in purely cash, exchanging cash in terms, you know, it's completely anonymous at the point of holding it. At least it may not be at the point of withdrawal, but at the point of holding it, it's anonymous and private. And the other aspect is, you know, the worrying erosion of the kind of, or the lack of inclusion, perhaps, of emerging digital assets, where, you know, there is a gap in whether people have the right technology, or sorry, my phone is ringing there.
We're live.
Apologies for that. We're live.
It's a live TV.
We'll edit that out, and then we won't. You know, some people don't have access to the web or devices, and, you know, there's a kind of digital literacy component, which clearly is not needed for picking up a piece of paper or a coin and handing it over at a shop. So I think that there are other key factors, but more often than not, those are the two things I see come up as the fears around losing cash. but then there's subsequent fears of adopting something like a central bank digital currency that we've covered extensively on the show, and the surveillance and the control and all those aspects. So on one hand, you've got the fears of loss of cash on one side, and then you've got the fears of what would follow it on the other. And it's going to be interesting to kind of dance between those two ideas as we go through this conversation.
Totally, Dan. It brings up to me, we've often had this question of this, agendas aside for one moment. I always try and say that because, I can't put them aside. They're all there. But we often would just look at just the march of technology, how that fits in. We talked about, a lot of things being eroded by this, potentially by this digitalization and where they want to go with it. But the technology itself, doesn't have to be used in those ways and could be neutral. It's the old idea of, I want to hold back any digital progress, but did you want to hold back the internet? And did you, and again, that same inclusion thing aspect, Dan, how much did the internet, again, it's a huge another philosophical debate. Did it improve our lives? What did it do for us? But again, older people did have to learn new skills and, move on to those ways. And there were pros and cons to it. So I think it's a much bigger topic than just getting, particularly when it comes to digital stuff, it's evil or it's not. I always try and say this, it can be used in a way to increase efficiencies and in a decentralized manner, give us more options, or it can be used for the surveillance and the greater centralization. So it has those two qualities to it. And I think it's oversimplifying just to say it's digital, it's a digital shift, anything's a digital shift, Bitcoin's a digital shift, therefore it is bad. And I think it is, like these things, what is being created out of these technological shifts and where are they on the good and bad spectrum themselves rather than the shift itself?
Yeah, I think there's always a technological adoption curve, and it's interesting, when people talk. I remember I was actually working in financial services at the early proliferation of digital banking or online banking, and people were saying the same things then about online banking. But what was interesting to observe actually is, in many cases, it was the older generations that were adopting it more frequently than some of the younger people at the time. Now that very quickly changed. It became, the most technological advancements often start with the younger generations and kind of progress through the eras as a general rule. That's certainly a component. And the other aspect then, when you look at digital technologies and you look at how the world of finances change and how people pay for things, it clearly has an impact on things like jobs as well. Again, looking back in my time in financial services and banking, where people used to go visit the cash tellers, for instance, or the cashiers, then over time would transition to the cash points, and then depositing things like cash and checks can now be done in an automated fashion. In fact, you can now scan. Checks are very much declining in circulation, but you can scan it on your apps now, and there's different ways for people to transact that weren't previously available, all enabled by technology, of course. And for many people, that makes their life more convenient, and that's always the driver of things like this is simplicity and convenience. Although, again, we could always argue what that simplicity and convenience is traded off against that ends up making our life more complex anyway. But that's a bigger discussion. So there is that aspect as well, the knock-on impact of digital technology. But that's a much wider conversation, but certainly something that does come up when people are talking about the world of finance, because that changing world of finance and automation, digitization does also impact on jobs. So there's a number of factors here. But the thing I'm interested to explore next, Sam, is the fact, when I think about cash as an asset, in many ways, despite its privacy features and its anonymous nature, it's also the most centralized asset that we can possibly own, meaning that it's issued by the central government, banks, overseen through policy by the central governments, and it's pretty much inflationary in nature, meaning that the value of the asset that you hold can actually be largely shifted over time by factors largely out of your control, as we're seeing right now. Totally. People's purchasing power massively dropping. So the value of the asset, again, not that I'm saying that the value of any other asset is under your control, stocks and shares, gold, silver, or anything like that, but the stability of the asset isn't baked in, although it is relatively stable over time.
Well, you can look at the resilience, Dan. You don't have to say that the resilience of an asset versus the history of, and this is something you can research you haven't done before. Look at the history of fiat currencies, how they rise and fall. That it's kind of baked into the fact that they have to fail in the end. And I think that's really important to understand, that it is the most centralizedly controlled asset. The supply is completely controlled out of your hands, and therefore, you can just see through history. And I always go back to down here, the pivotal point was how, the cash we hold now is not the cash we would have held at a certain point in the history. It's a completely different beast. And so compare, some people don't realize that different. That's really important. Those are two completely different things, because one used to be backed, as a proper promissory note, backed by a tangible asset. So it used to be literally, I promised to pay the bearer. And obviously with the gold standard in the States, pre 71, 72. And also, in UK history, you're looking about, we talk about sterling, pound sterling. Well, that's a pound of sterling silver. So at that point, it is a really useful form of just transacting a piece of paper that have the assets, the tangible assets behind them. So you really just passing over promissory notes. But we're in a situation now of pure fiat currency where it's backed by absolutely nothing. And I think this is what's important, Dan, that the real issue about moving away, to other solutions is not about moving away from cash. It's about moving away from fiat currency. So whenever people look at alternatives, it's not because they're anti-cash. Like we discussed, I'm pro that privacy and that mode of transaction. It's fabulous, but it's from a store of value point of view. So from pure transactional purposes, absolutely, it gives you all those options. But as a store of value, something to hold your wealth in, you only have to look in history, and this goes across all fiat currencies, that you're losing value at an incredible rate. So there's an amazing chart from 71 onwards, and where you look at it compared to gold, and I haven't got the exact figures, but it literally goes from in 1971, you might get, and I'm going to make up the figures, I've got the hand here, but you might get 100 ounces, of gold for £10,000. By the year 2000, that's down to 10 ounces, and by year today, we're down to 1 ounce. So that's not the figures, guys, but I just give that example of how much we've lost. So 99% loss in purchasing power against an asset like gold. So that, if you sat in gold from that point on, and a lot of people started to do that when they realized that the currency was no longer tied to the physical metals, they retained some value where everybody else was losing extreme amounts of value over time. So their wealth being eroded, and Dan, I always talk about the Cantillon effect when in these fiat currencies, whereby, the powers that be, like you said, they're issued by central banks, got all their chums in the banking industry, the top players. They are printing money out of thin air, coming into the system. They know it's not worth anything. They are often buying tangible assets. We see that they're buying up commodities, land, real things that have real value before the inflation has kicked in. Because what they've done is increase the money supply. Therefore, you increase the supply. Therefore, the actual value goes down. That's inflation in a nutshell. By the time that increased money supply is filtered down to the man on the street, you have lost. He has lost value. So you can see how this rigged game, and you can see that in the charts from 71 onwards, the wealth inequality gap just goes crazy from there on down, because we've got this system where actually the top people are printing it before that, kind of inflationary effect has kicked in. They're buying real assets, almost essentially for free. By the time that new money's come to the system, we're actually suffering inflation and losing value. So again, it's a rigged game at both ends of the spectrum. So it's important to understand those factors about fiat currency that, looking at going, you may be looking to diversify away from just holding cash is not an anti-cash stance.
Yes.
What it is an anti-fiat currency model stance. And that's, really the core of Bitcoin. Like I said earlier, Bitcoin is not going up against cash, saying cash is a problem, you should go digital. What it's saying is, we create a monetary system that is at the antithesis of this fiat currency system, which has no cap on the supply, is inflated to enormous levels, and all these currencies end up failing in the end, which is why you get currency resets in history. You don't have to go far back in history to look at what happens in South America, a lot of those countries. But this happens to all fiat currencies. And the amazing thing about Bitcoin's creation was there was a new currency model that had a hard-coded, hard-fixed supply that worked within this digital age that we already live in. So it's using the tools of the digital age to create a current system that was the antithesis of fiat currency. So it wasn't an anti-cash movement. So I always have that question when, like you said, Dan, when someone get that, it's about Bitcoin. So no, keep cash. And that's not to say, I don't advocate absolutely diversify across all. They all have their tools, have some cash, but that's not what the Bitcoin argument or the case of Bitcoin is about. And I think that's really important to understand.
Yeah, it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. I see it in the comments frequently. We can be talking about crypto or Bitcoin or something like that, and it's almost like then that is the counter argument. Just a blank statement. We need to preserve cash, which is something we don't disagree with. But but what we do have a challenge with is where that shuts down the conversation about alternatives. Because
and exactly that. And also, I want people to aware, like that's the point of the awareness. If you sat with your wealth only in cash, what risks do you have there? Because absolutely understand it, that the risk with digitization of an asset like Bitcoin is people often bring up that point of, what if the internet goes down? Absolutely, you are reliant on some other factors. But I think it's important to realize also with cash, you are also reliant on some other factors. And I think sometimes that's not brought into the discussion enough, which is this fact of, you can be losing value. Its nature as legal tender is centrally decided upon. So that, I think it's really important to understand those issues of just sitting in cash, or looking at that as the panacea. Understanding the pros and cons of all these ones, and get more into some of the other pros and of Bitcoin, because sometimes I think people think it's just a digital, cash replacement, and I don't like digital, therefore I want to keep cash. But the reason Bitcoin is valued today at $30,000 a Bitcoin and has had huge growth is not just because it's electronic money, because of the qualities that it has that maybe people who are new to this area don't really understand. And that's very understandable, because the info and the base info is hard to get to, and you need to do some work to understand it. It's much more than just an e-cash, a digital cash. The decentralized aspect, the permissionless aspect, which we can touch more on, those aspects are why it has so much value. If it literally was just an e-cash, it wouldn't be valued for what it is. People who understand its qualities, that's why it has such a value on the market and will potentially increase in value over time. So, coupled with also it's the way it's been designed down in terms of its limited supply, which is why often it's equated to, a digital version of a gold, because of the finite aspect of it. And actually it's even more finite than gold, because you could potentially, find a new seam of gold somewhere, mine it, whereas Bitcoin is hard coded, completely limited. So I think it's important to look at all the nuanced pros and cons of these different asset classes, whether it's cash or whether it's any types of digital assets like Bitcoin, and understand the potential problems with cash, particularly in the era we're in, because it's a different beast from the cash you may have held, especially in as the world currency pre 71, 72 on the gold standard. That was a different cash. And I'm almost, something came to me, Dan, we talk about, is cash really king? Well, cash may be king of the different types of fiat currency, but does that make it king of the asset classes? That's a different thing. And that's where we need to look at, a means of transacting and versus or a store of wealth, and where you find the balance between those two, and how that fits into how you want to move forward yourself.
I think, Sam, it's a really important distinction that you've made there around our ability to transact with one another and our ability to store and grow wealth.
Yeah.
Because they are interlinked, but they are also separate. And actually, what we've talked about within our Navigating the Financial Reset program is that diversification of assets. That's a sensible approach to take in any economy, but particularly under the kind of turbulent circumstances we find ourselves within now, in the midst of a financial reset. And we've talked a lot about what the financial reset is, when it started and when it'll end, and the idea that there is a fixed start point and end point and all that sort of stuff we touched upon. But
all we can say for certain, then, we're in, as we talked about in a lot of our cycles, we're in really changing times.
Yes.
This is a confluence of many cycles coming together. The current debt-based fiat system has to implode and be reset. So it's not something like we said that people sometimes say this could go on. It's just that they're getting involved to do a certain reset. The system has to be reset. Obviously, the powers that be want to reset it in their way and keep their game going under a new guise. But it's important to understand that it's not that the system that exists today and those fiat currencies is sustainable itself. I think that's another issue with just thinking about cash as a fiat currency. That's why there are huge problems with that, and it is coming to its end in terms of its fiat currency life. So I think that's important to be aware. So we are in completely, as we call this uncharted territory, because that's where we are, Dan. And probably nobody here listening has lived through a financial reset of this type. And I think that's where it's important to have different options and understand the qualities and the possibilities they can give you and the protection they can give you. And we'll look at more of Bitcoin's qualities in a moment, I'm sure.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned as well the risks and fears around digital currencies, the fact that it requires online access. In fact, MK, nice touch on the name there, has raised that going digital has its problems too. Lights out, what you do then. I think again that's a very common objection, and thank you for sharing that. And I would like to add to that, because the reality is, again, there was a time where we used paper ledgers, and that we didn't. We weren't so connected via the web. Transactions happen on a very local level. People kept paper ledgers, but now we basically operate on a digital ledger, whether that's in the blockchain, the new technology, or a traditional digital ledger. And the reality is now, if you think about it, if you want to get cash out, if you actually want to handle cash, you go to an ATM, a cash machine, which relies upon the internet, and I can tell you firsthand that they do. So, and power. And if that goes down, then the ATMs go down anyway. And then you could say, well, I can go into the bank. Well, you can, but again, if the internet is gone, then the cashiers at the desk who would be issuing you with the cash won't be able to access their systems to verify your balance, to verify you hold the funds, to verify your identity, which is obviously a component of the traditional banking system. So you wouldn't be able to take any cash out anyway if we had a kind of collapse of the internet. And the same is true if you were shopping. Okay, we're resilient people. I'm sure if we had a major collapse in the internet or power, we wouldn't. Well, you'd hope that we wouldn't allow, after the last few years, who knows? You'd hope we wouldn't allow each other to starve. But the same token, again, spending in most shops, most people now use EPOS systems. That's electronic point of sale, which means most transactions are also gone through a digital connected till. And you watch what happens. If you've ever been to a store where they've had a power outage or their own internet goes down, most stores won't take payment. Even though they could take a paper record. Most will not transact. So even if you have already got the cash out and you're trying to transact in the store, most stores will be connected. And that's not all stores. Of course, you can still go to market traders if you're lucky in your local area. And there's always workarounds. But I would say the problems that would be faced if the internet went down would be equivalent between cash and digital. Not the same, because of course, some people hold cash at home. Again, if you are someone who holds cash at home, we've shared some horror stories. I've shared some horror stories on this show about where people have had theft or house fires or kept notes for so long that they're no longer legal tender. And that's one sure way to lose the store of value. So there's all kinds of these complexities and nuances that come along with that. And plus, when we look at the kind of catastrophic level cyber attack or internet outage, it's important to actually contrast that with the probabilities of that happening, but also to look at it holistically, as we've started to touch upon, in terms of its implication on cash as well. And in fact, if we are facing a catastrophic event that would cause the internet to go down, we're probably more worried about the catastrophic event than whether we can.
I've always said it down. We're in a complete different ball game, and it wouldn't be as simple as, well. And I think, and again, I'm not suggesting the person who asked that question believes this, believes that scenario, but it's important to point out it wouldn't be, well, we've got the same economy playing out. Somebody's got cash, somebody's locked out of their crypto. We're in a completely paradigm shift of everything, aren't we? Yeah. At that point. So absolutely, you could have hoarded some cash. That might be of use, but how that would play out over a time, over a few weeks, we're in a complete paradigm shift. I mean, so the whole economy would, everything you're used to doing would change, overnight. So again, I always say this: if that's your real strong intuition, if that's the way you believe things are going, then you absolutely should prepare, for that. But again, that's where diversification comes in, is you're across all these different aspects. And, I think absolutely, if you were, I'm not saying you're convinced, but you had a really strong feeling that we face an apocalyptic future with no, then you wouldn't want to be overly leveraged in the digital side of things. You'd want to be more in physical, tangible. But you have to come to your own thesis. And I think it is important then to, be realistic of what that would actually entail. It wouldn't be, well, we got a public event and I'm fine now. Commerce will continue for me because I've got some cash. It will be a whole different ballgame. Like I said, I think the concerns, the priorities would be completely different, and the whole economy would instantly be different. Yeah. So all those what ifs, always exist, and they're important, and I take them all into account. But I think people can get paralyzed by them as well. I think that can be an issue, because there is no certainty to anything, and yet if that stops you making proactive action, diversifying, then that can be not helpful in itself, because you might be having a mindset that actually of something that never happens. And as I always said, you stay present life. If that did happen, well, you'd react at that time. And I think, and that's where relying on any of these different assets as your security isn't a holistic viewpoint. They are tools and bonuses and wealth, but actually in that scenario, we're back to your own wits and people and contacts and human behavior. So I think I think it's important to give an overview of that very idea of, well, the internet goes down, because where we are, it's reality is, Dan, is that it's almost like the technology question is a tricky one, because we've come so far. A lot of the answers to people not wanting any control, I understand it, is we go back fully to all the internet, which doesn't allow any surveillance, whatever. And that in itself is a huge paradigm shift, isn't it?
Yeah, go full medieval.
Yeah. And again, we've always said that it's not that I'm pro digital or anti that, or I'm just trying to find my way. I think we're all trying to navigate within the space and work with what we've got and where we are, and that could change. And I think that's the point. You're not, whatever path you take, you're not stuck on it, because we don't know. And I think people who are agile and able to pivot, and I think by having more options and understanding more things, you're already set up to be more successful, however things play out.
Yeah, and I think the kind of off-grid type living is available. It's available to us if we want to pursue that type of more natural living. I think that's always the key, is to remember what options are available to you, and that's again a key of being empowered. Now, the other part about the question about online, and here's the interesting thing. So there have been governments that have shut down internet. We've seen it before. It happened during the pandemic. One of the dictators actually did shut the internet down for several days. We've also seen cyber attacks, and the possibility of a grand cyber attack is much greater than ever before. The tools that liberate us in terms of the technologies that make us able to do things like this also enable potential malfeasance and misuse. But again, when we think about the current system, the current traditional financial system, most will use obviously very secure servers and huge server beds to actually facilitate. And you think about the kind of scale of servers that's required to run a mainstream banking system is enormous, and the power behind it. But again, it's all hyper connected, so it's still a problem. Now, the benefit of blockchain-based technology is it's a distributed ledger, meaning that my computer is not, but my computer could be underwriting, it could be mining the transactions, and there's a piece of the puzzle effectively held on my device in simplest terms. But that is then distributed across thousands and thousands of, if not millions of devices, and it's a totally distributed network. So if the internet goes down, technically the moment it boots back up, it's all still there. It's still held.
The immutable factor is important to understand. Yeah,
it's immutable. Whereas actually the same is not necessarily true. It can be true, but it's not necessarily true of traditional servers. So there's when it comes to internet going down, the blockchain technology again as a development offers greater long-term security against
totally. And Dan, it's good. I'm glad you made that point, because actually it offers that on both ends of the spectrum. So it offers that in CBDCs, because that's that. And again, I've mooted that's a possible way in. They discussed it in the last episode where I brought up that article suggesting about Russian hackers looking to take down the financial system of the West. That kind of narrative coming through, potential cyber attacks. The distributed ledger technology does make a more secure system and a more secure ledger, so people don't use their funds in a CBDC world that they might want to bring in, but equally in a Bitcoin sense, which is a decentralized manner. Because exactly your point, even if you went after, able to get every person who's validating the Bitcoin network on their computer across the world, if there's one person left, then the network still functions. Okay, and it's that clever that it will adjust its algorithm to its mining time so that one person can run the network. So it's an incredible piece of technology. But you're absolutely right. That advance does give better security of records and ledgers. And again, we've seen that, on all sides of the fence. So the underlying tech has that baked into it, which is, an advance, no question, because it's about, and again, I always say it's leaving agendas aside. That's on a pure tech level. It's negating points of failure within a system. rather than attacking one server and that taking down the whole network, it doesn't matter because that is distributed across the network. And we always want to, people who don't understand the sort of distributed nature of things, that's why I often talk about Odyssey as a platform being on the blockchain, whereas YouTube is a centralized system. Everything's on YouTube's server, so they control it. If they delete something from their server, one of your videos, they often do, Dan, because you get can get shadow banned.
Yep.
Therefore, they're in control of taking it out. Once you've got a distributed system, everybody's hosting it. So it doesn't matter that one person takes it down, the rest are already hosting it, it stays up. So that distributed ledger technology has great advances. And again, this is at all ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, definitely. So these are important variables to consider. And I think, again, bringing it back to what I think is at the root of the concern of the fear of losing cash is the privacy aspect, meaning that in trading or transacting in cash, you effectively, in many ways, eliminate the possibility of the government surveilling your activities. Now, clearly, if you're in a black market illicit activity, that's something that's deeply favorable to you. But actually, those people in black markets have also discovered that there's actually even greater potential within the kind of digital asset space, or equal potential. But for the average person who is, ethically and morally, well, again, I have to be careful to put a value judgment in here, because what's deemed black market, who decides what's illicit activity?
Well, exactly. It's been the last 3 years, Dan, when that question's too. Breathing became an illicit activity.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. So let's not even open that can of worms. But I think you get my point, is that most people who want privacy aren't doing it because they've got something to hide. It's actually that they just want to have the government outside their front door and not in it. A lot of people over the course of the COVID chapter said that the government was so intrusive, it literally felt like they had the government in their home. And when the government can start to see into what you're spending your money on, how you're spending your money on, then that is a very worrying future. And it's no surprise under the current kind of culture that we're facing that people have including myself, real concerns about the government surveillance, because day by day we're seeing an increasing in digital surveillance in every single way. So that's clearly a real fear when it comes to things like central bank digital currencies, even if, as we saw in the digital pound consultation, the initial proposal does not put that forward as a part of the proposal. We know it's always something that is possible, as is the programmable nature, which, take it to its ultimate draconian outcome is the kind of social credit system where, access denied, you haven't had your jab, or, you said this word, or, you said something that's deemed as hate speech, and all of a sudden you can't get on the bus or the train or get paid, or, your welfare is cancelled. So all of a sudden, the CBDC offers that dystopian reality, which is a real fear under the current climate. So therefore, cash, when you look at it in its purest form, thinking, well, you can't impose conditions on the use of the cash. But again, can you? Is that true? Because again, look how society was divided during COVID. It felt like society was split between the jabbed and unjabbed. And it almost felt like, unless you're with the prospect of things like vaccine passports, it was literally like the government was able to intervene. And in many cases, the government just offered guidance and the businesses complied.
Yeah.
So it wasn't even enforced. It wasn't even legally enforceable.
No, we talked about that, using the businesses to be the kind of boots on the ground, and almost distant from themselves. Like I said, the traveling example, it was, getting the airlines to do the dirty work. It wasn't the border forces. I found that really interesting. It was border forces didn't care about paperwork. It was the airlines who had their extra staff, grilling you. So again, the use of the business.
So that type of social credit system can exist with or without a CBDC. That's my point. It's under the right conditions that we saw in the last few years, and how that was manipulated and created. So again, we have to be optimistic that we are moving away from that type of tight control, but we know now it's within the tool set, and we have to be vigilant. So when we look at cash itself, of course, unlike a digital asset, you can't program the use case into the cash note or coin itself, as when it comes to transacting. But you can culturally and socially and coercively influence traders to take certain policies and serve certain people and not others. We've seen that. So it's not necessarily the mode of transaction or the means of transaction itself that is necessarily the problem when it comes to that element of control. But we know that, you know, that in a market where there is free, do we have a free market as a subject for another conversation, for another day? But, you know, we can still, I can say, Sam, you know, if the government isn't allowing me to trade with these shops, I can come to you and say, can I pay you in cash? And you have the sovereign right to make that decision, and whether you abide by any laws or government regulations or guidance is down to the individual. So at least with cash, we can still choose to trade amongst each other. And, you know, during this time, we've seen a lot of people talking about localization, which I think is a great side effect of this, actually restoring local communities, creating, you know, again, have to be careful, because that's in the 15-minute city agenda, really. You know, it's like, careful what you wish for. Again, there is ways of achieving things. There is reasonable intent, but questionable means. But I do think local trade is a good thing. But when we're talking about things like, you know, again, reverting almost to barter and exchange, it then becomes incredibly complex, because, you know, the fact that we use currency, the fact that we use a currency to kind of indicate the value of something, it means that we don't have to weigh up, well, you know, if I want to trade this cup, you know, how much is this worth? If, you know, we have a central means of transaction, that means we don't have to work all those things out. What possessions do I have that I can trade with you, or what skills do I have that I can trade with you? And again, I don't see any problem with those things. I think they're good things to be able to do, but at scale and cross borders.
Well, that's the point. It takes us back to, and again, not being pro or against it, a completely local economy, you know, on a very small scale. And I think it's interesting to look at what, you know, you talked about cash giving you those options for accepting it. That's what Bitcoin's doing in the digital world.
Yes.
So I'd say it's accepting that we have a digital world, and that we are doing cross border. We are, you know, in a good sense, you know, having economies with each other across you know, vast distances where cash isn't applicable. So that's important to remember. So what Bitcoin does is give you that way of not having a state intermediary or a third party. It's the only electronic, you know, it's not the only one now, but I've just talked about it when it came to integration. It's the only version where there wasn't a third party involved, and it's permissionless. So exactly what you said, Dan, you've got a sovereign choice to accept cash. Anybody in the world has got a sovereign choice to accept Bitcoin, and it's permissionless. So there is no applying for a Bitcoin account. There is no going through that process. Anybody in the world, again, with an internet connection, within a couple of minutes can have a Bitcoin address and receive Bitcoin. That's the permissionless nature of it. And I think that's what's interesting, because especially when you talk about cross-border payments, this is a way of transacting across the world. And we've talked about certain, you know, people having podcasts out who are doing work in the States down and being debanked from every platform, whether it's their legacy bank, whether it's all the internet banks or the payment providers like Stripe or PayPal, completely locked out of those. How do they continue functioning? Using Bitcoin or accepting, you know, crypto payments, because that is not going through a third party who censors payments to certain people. And I always give that example. It's important to understand that, you know, you can make a payment. There's nobody in between us. It's gone into the pool to be mined, but it's not based on our two identities, who we are, where we live, or anything. It's just literally a payment. And that's where, you know, a lot of people storing wealth, but equally know they can move money across borders, no questions asked, and no, you know, prohibitive paperwork or extreme fees. You try and move £1 million between two different countries, two different bank accounts, fully legit £1 million. That's, you know, except fully, you know, compliant with all the anti-money laundering rules, all paid up. That's still a hell of a job, and you've got a lot of people involved in that chain, a lot of time delays, and a lot of, you know, quite extortionate charges. That can happen in Bitcoin in 5 to 10 minutes, and there's no third party involved. So that borderless, permissionless nature down is really interesting, especially in the world today, talking about moving and people being agile. It doesn't matter where you are. Once you've got your Bitcoin wallet, you're not in a country. You're everywhere. So this is, again, is looking at the qualities of these assets over and aboard, you know, even cash or gold. You know, when I last traveled down, you look at all the signs of the airport, how, you know, if you've got this amount of cash, you need to declare it. If you're holding gold, you need to declare it. Potentially going to get harder and harder to move these assets across borders. With a digital asset like Bitcoin, you've got nothing. Your Bitcoin is everywhere and nowhere. So again, that's another aspect to it I think people don't understand, is that the permissionless aspect being able to be in the system without going through a third party, without having to be validated, and then be able to trade peer to peer without any intervention. And that was a great boon for a Russian person I contact Russia when it all kicked off there. The SWIFT system down, locked out of legacy banking system, not at all locked out of using Bitcoin. So I think that's an important aspect, that it gives you that extra option without that state or third party intervention, be it there is no company or state involved in that transaction.
Yeah, and you mentioned, there's a couple of interesting recent examples. What you think of the individuals is an aside, but Nigel Farage,
Yep.
Lawrence Fox, both had bank accounts shut down in recent weeks. You can't do that in Bitcoin.
No, I know people. Dan was watching something yesterday about some alternative health products. Again, PayPal shutting down any sales of a perfectly safe, in my opinion, but safe natural product. But we know they're clamping down trying to get that. How do they get people? They debank them. That's the real way. We talked about Operation Choke Point and Choke Point 2.0. That is a power source of debanking people by them, leaning on all these payment providers that they cannot do business. They can all accept digital assets, Bitcoin, other digital assets. So that is really important, and that is happening across the world today. That without that possibility within this digital space, a lot of people wouldn't have been able to transact with clients across the world who are looking to get either incredible education info or even alternative health products, things they really need. And again, we are looking at a bigger economy across the world rather than local. And again, if we want to go completely no digital, no internet, whatever, then we are back looking at, completely sourcing locally. And that's a whole nother philosophical debate. But within the world we are today, we can see positive use cases, off the charts in this last few years. That's happening.
Yeah, we have to be careful about how many times we talk about the lights going out, because I don't know if you noticed, my lights went out during a few minutes ago.
Well, last time, Dan,
last
time we were riffing on that whole subject of what the internet goes down.
Going down.
Somebody in my house did pull the plug unwittingly, and it went down.
Well,
but again, it came back on.
Yeah, I had problems with my lights. So if you notice what suddenly happened, my lights went out, and I've got a backup power for them, but I've had some problems. So you might see me reaching off screen in a minute to fix this. Another problem on live broadcast. Just can't control for these things. But speaking of control, again, cash as an asset. So recapping, it's centralized in its issuance. It's issued by the central bank, manipulated by central governments, yet it's decentralized in its usage. So once you have it, which is what makes it quite interesting, because it's not purely centralized, it's decentralized in its use case, whereas Bitcoin is decentralized in its issuance and it's decentralized in its usage. And that distinction is important. And of course, we know that governments can manipulate the value of cash, as we've talked about, whether it's monetary policy or the various different issuing new notes, issuing new cash, monetary policy, the various different tools that the government can artificially manipulate the value of money. But that's not limited to cash. Government action can also intervene with stocks and commodities and other forms of investment. So it's not exclusive to cash.
But if you look at cash's, not cash's, fiat currencies track record and history, it's not. That's why people often, we talk about assets down. People are scared by volatility of assets, and I always do this shape, because it's, oh my god, the ups, downs, and whatever. But then show them a fiat currency chart, and many people have never seen that. Show them a fiat currency against another asset, because everything has to be valued against something else, and then you may change your view on sitting in fiat currency as a store of wealth. Again, we always talk this distinction. Transaction, pretty great. Store of wealth as an asset, just look at its track record. And actually, people sometimes feel they're in this chart. Dan always do this, feel like it's going straight across, don't realize they're in the chart that's only going down. So they're scared by that volatility. Often there's a lot of growth in those, volatile assets that are on a growth curve. And actually, the other one is on a complete diminishing curve with no upside. So being aware of that can just try and get you a better relationship with these different assets, so you're clear about what they are and what they're not, and what purpose they serve and where they're not so strong. And until you've weighed all those different aspects, I think it's oversimplified to just say that's the one for me versus that. It's and there are whys that might be preferable to you for certain reasons, or that might be, but until you've got all the info, it's hard to make that decision.
Yeah, and I've also heard some really interesting descriptions that the fiat system itself is legalized corruption. it's legalizing the ability for central banks to, and giving them the authority to create money without inherent value or backing.
It's theft,
So, this creates an unfair advantage for governments and central institutions, financial institutions in particular, who can benefit from this process, and the profits derived from those activities, whereas the individual doesn't have that possibility. So it's tricky, because a lot of the people who are very in favor of preserving cash do so because of the privacy elements that we touched upon. But at the same time, the same people want to escape government control and influence. So it's a really tricky balance, because on one hand, you're preserving the thing that gives you privacy, but on the other hand, you're also propping up the fiat money system, which is ultimately the most centralized problem, centralized power structure that we're up against.
Which is why I say it's, self-custody your own cash is king of the fiat system. But, it's not further than that. That's the point within that fiat system. But the issues are the fiat system, right? That's the problem. Again, if it, like we all said, if it was cash backed by real tangible assets, then great, but it isn't. And like you said, it's being absolutely printed away at an incredible rate. And, a lot of people argue at a simple level, it's theft. Because as I said, from the Cantillon effect, if you control the money printers, in inverted commas, because most of it's not actually being printed on notes, it's being just written onto screens, and you're able then to spend that on real world assets, then they literally have picked that for free. And as I said to you, by the time that increased money supply has filtered down to the man on the street, they have been robbed of value, of purchasing power. So, that is baked into the system, which is why, always go back to it, understanding what happened, with the world reserve currency, the dollar in 172, coming with the gold standard, is really important. And that's where getting educated about what's gone on is helpful when you're thinking about how you're going to navigate forward from here, because we have an extra element here now, which is we're not just holding cash now, we're holding cash potentially towards a financial reset of some sort. And I like to give the example, like if you were holding all your money in cash and that's where your wealth was, well, at some point, whether we like it or not, they may start to phase out cash, and it may take a long time, so rather than overnight, because they do want to preserve the people and they have to do that. But at a certain point, if you want your value one-to-one, then it may be, well, you need to come through our system and bank it all to cash it in. So again, I think that's the point, that Europe cash is an asset that can change overnight in terms of it legislation. That's what I always talk about as we're coming through a currency reset of some sort. Assets that just are not central code, they are as they are, they bypass that and go around it. I almost view that as a thin gate. Now, no one knows how it's going to play out, but always, give the example that, a tin of chickpeas today is a tin of chickpeas tomorrow. Some gold today is some gold tomorrow. A note that's centrally issued and is, deemed legal tender by the powers that be, it can have its status changed by tomorrow, Dan. And that's the big difference, isn't it? I think in terms of assets, or in terms of something you're going to transact in the short term.
Yeah, and interesting enough, I saw a report yesterday that said that the UK is the only country amongst the group of 7 most wealthy nations where inflation is still rising. So there's real evidence that your cash is purchasing power and its value is decreasing month on month under this environment. So that point we've made several times during this about diversification of assets is key. But drawing on some of the central tenets of the conversation here around the fiat money system and its challenges, and I think most people who watch this type of content will be in alignment and in agreement that the fiat money system itself is corrupt, and it enables central institutions to have unsweeping powers, which is something that certainly viewers of our podcast have been very concerned about. So whilst, again, we talk about preserving privacy with cash, the question then becomes, what's the alternative? Because immediately people then fear central bank digital currencies, which, again, I share those fears, and I think both of us do. But their actual ultimate manifestation, they could actually just end up being a digital copy of what we have now. We speculated that on the last episode, although in the Brit pound, the Bitcoin, as they're calling it, proposal has several nuances that offers some warning signs that you need to be aware of in terms of its early thinking. But it is just early thinking, and it's highly likely that there'll be some international standard that comes in for all central bank digital currencies. Again, that is another concern, because it's a globalized pathway, and these signals point in the same direction, and that's a real concern. But it's not a binary choice between cash or a central bank digital currency. Of course, there are many other assets, but when we're talking about transactions, we've touched upon Bitcoin, many times during this conversation. Yeah, and Bitcoin in its origin, if you read the original white paper, was really to deal a blow to the financial system, to the fiat system that we've been discussing about. And again, there's all kinds of speculation. We've touched upon that in the previous episode as well, but where it came from. We don't need to go into that again today. But let's take it on its premise that it is here to disrupt the financial system. Let's look at the factors. It's decentralized. It almost completely eliminates government intervention. It gives monetary freedom and privacy. It has resistance to inflation. In fact, it could be described as deflationary. It enables permissionless and trustless transactions. It's within an immutable ledger. Offers borderless and permissionless transactions. There are so many advantages to it. But then, of course, there's the flip side, which inevitably comes up next. It's like, yeah, but Dan, what happens when the government ban cryptocurrency and they ban Bitcoin or they regulate it? And of course, that's a major concern. And I floated this idea also, Sam, in several of our conversations, because the fact that Bitcoin could be universally accepted does also pave the way to a decentralized single currency. And even though it's decentralized and it can't be manipulated and controlled by central authorities, I do think there are concerns about having a centralized, a single digital currency. Although that concern is mitigated somewhat by the fact that it's decentralized. But again, as we've talked about,
and it's not the whims of the monetary policy.
It's not the whims of the monetary policy.
So it's a completely different beast. So it's and again, these are really hard things to project forward with, which is why don't try and project too forward. Look at the possibilities, because how that would play out, it's very unclear. And how the whole shift across the world, how that's going to play out. But I just want to reiterate, that a lot of the, I think a lot of people think that people are in Bitcoin just for there's nothing to it and they're gambling on it and it's good. The reason a lot of people sit in Bitcoin is because of they see the qualities and they see the properties of it, and a lot, as we talked about, the big boys coming into Bitcoin. I mean, they've always been there at some level, but them coming in is not just to manipulate the market; it's because they know they don't want to sit in fiat either. Yes. So it's they understand, and that's that's that point. Always go back to 71, 72, where a lot of the clued up people moved out of the dollar and into assets because when they came with the gold standard, because they realized I'm suddenly going to lose a lot of value here. So you're absolutely down. There are lots of qualities to Bitcoin and how these pieces of jigsaw fit together going forward is going to be very interesting to see.
Yes, but I think the important thing right now, my biggest concern, I'm concerned about losing cash for all the reasons we've cited, but I'm also concerned that people are turning a blind eye to Bitcoin and the digital asset, because right now there is an entire counter economy that's emerged from this. And I think this is something that, again, is dear to a lot of people. When people are talking about things like barter and localized trade and all those sort of things, it's happening. It's happening both physically on a local level, but it's also happening digitally. It's there is entire economies emerging outside of the current system using Bitcoin. There's many organizations now actually take Bitcoin, local, online, international, and various other cryptocurrencies or altcoins, to be more specific. So it's understanding it that during this unique time in history where the regulatory process is still emerging, there is an active counter economy. And all that means is, yes, it does include black market activity and illegal activities, but in the main state, it's actually day-to-day transactions that are occurring. In fact, our community, the Elevate community, there is a function now that I can enable payments by Ethereum-based tokens. So I could technically take payment in ETH or various altcoins that are created using ETH standards. So it's amazing. It's amazing that we can transact now. So we do have a means of transaction as well as a store of value.
Well, exactly, Dan. So it's giving us more tools within that digital framework. And again, if you're completely want to eschew all digitalization, then that is a different path. But it's almost like we always have an example. If you're going to eschew technology, all power to you, and that's your path, and then that doesn't involve digital assets. But if you are still involved in, dealing across the world, different people, and want to do commerce and being digital, then this is a decentralized tool within it, rather than being stuck. I always say, I don't want to be stuck just in their centralized tools. How that's going to play out, how you've got more options. That's the point, isn't it? I think that's what's really important, is giving yourself more options. The more options you've got and the more tools you've got, the better prepared you are in changing times to pivot when needed be, and have ways of transacting outside of that main, most centralized system.
Yeah,
which, like you said, which we're seeing happening.
Yes, and as you've talked about, is that it removes all those intermediaries.
Yep.
So all the costs of transaction, all the fees, and it's moving out of the sluggish systems where you'd literally sometimes wait days for payments to arrive. Now you've literally got an almost instantaneous payment structure.
Yep.
that removes all those intermediaries that
you can verify. You don't again, trustless. That's the part of the blockchain that's so great in that there's no, I have to check that you've got it. We both know it's happened. It's all verified. So yeah, it's a very safe way of sending assets, sending payment. And because no one knows how it's going to play out, because I don't know how the whole world's going to play out, that doesn't stop me diversifying and learning more tools ready for different scenarios. I think that's the point. I think that's where the what ifs get paralyzing. And China banned Bitcoin about 7 times in its history. Nothing's changed essentially. So I always get the example. Well, they banned breathing fresh air and banned hugging your family. Well, it still went on. So again, that idea that it's not going to take different action based on what they might do, well, then that's completely paralyzing setup, isn't it, Dan? Because they can legislate whatever they want, and they're going to try to. It's whether we listen and how we behave. They want us to be the most easily manageable as possible. They want to, you to be easily. It's almost like in a financial reset or any kind of it. They want you to walk into their worlds and not to be a challenge, or they want to, almost from a financial reset point of view, they want to go after low-lying fruit. If they want to come for your assets, well, they're going to come for the most centralized assets that they control in their hands. If you really have been proactive, whatever, then there's not much they can do about that. That's what I always think is how there is no panacea simple answer, but how much more difficult a customer you're going to be for the tricksters.
Absolutely. And Karen in the comments, and this is benefit going live as we can bring up some of the conversations. So Karen says mass adoption of crypto needs to happen. Hopefully more and more people will start learning about crypto and accept as a means of exchange. And I think this point in particular is really important, because the reality is it is actually part of the resistance, because with the big players coming into the market, we've got 10 plus years of and over $1 trillion worth of assets accumulated by retail investors, i.e. people like you and I. So it means that the power at the moment is in the hands of the people. The moment that the central institutions start buying it up at scale and creating market moves that create enough fear in the market that people just start selling off their digital assets, all of a sudden the power balance shifts. So the reality is, in a way, holding a Bitcoin is one of the greatest acts of protest right now, because what it means is that more and more people hold the power, because ultimately governments serve the people and not the other way around. They may forget that, and we may forget that sometimes. But the reality is, if each one of us has holdings in Bitcoin, then we have a lot more power over the way that governments decide on our behalf.
Absolutely, and doing it in a sovereign way, Dan. Because what I can see is their plan is to get. They know this will become part of the mainstream world, be mass adopted, but not in the iteration that is sovereign. So that's what we're seeing shift, aren't we, Dan? That doing crypto properly, to Bitcoin, is taking it to your own self-custody, so you're in control of it. The mass adoption level will be, third-party institutions holding people's crypto, which is the complete antithesis, because, again, you're back into the third-party censorship issue. You're into the fact that your assets can be seized, your transaction be blocked, you can't withdraw it. So I think that's the world they're building, and they're doing an endlessly, kind of hatchet job on scaring as many retail investors out as much as they can, whilst they're quietly accumulating assets. And they'll build new systems that the later crowd come in, who aren't early adopters or pioneers, will have exposure to this new asset class, but in a completely centralized manner. And that's what we're seeing with the launch of these exchange traded funds on Bitcoin that have been mooted down for, by the big players, is that actually all their investors come in, they feel like they hold Bitcoin, but of course it's just in a fund held by a central authority that you could be turned on and off, because if you don't actually control or hold your assets. So I think that's the way they view controlling mass adoption and exposure to this market, which is the antithesis of what we're talking about, which is self-custody, getting on your own means, on your own grounds. And that takes more effort, more learning, but I think that's really important to do. And that's what they don't want the majority of people to do. And they want people to be corralled, as by the narratives, Dan, by the overall fear, and rather than people getting grounded education and understanding how to do it properly themselves and getting in now. And we see the other aspect is they're going to open these new doors in a centralized manner whilst they're trying to close down the more sovereign way, closing down the kind of what I call the on-ramps, getting a fiat currency into crypto yourself. Personally, it's going to get harder, and we're seeing that play out. Whereas coming through their brokers or coming through purchase will get easier. So again, that's the way they're trying to play this game, and and I think that's what we're seeing, and that's what we discuss in this podcast. That's the roadmap we're watching week by week, aren't we, Dan?
Yeah, we have to play our part in countering that, and I think we opened up today's conversation asking, is cash really king? Tune in to find out. Well, hopefully, having listened, the answer is not simple. And with many of these discussions, you're absolutely right, as you opened up, Sam, is that we need to understand the nuances of this conversation. Yep. So on a personal note, absolutely, I want to preserve cash for those privacy factors. But I'm also very open to things like Bitcoin and different forms of cryptocurrencies as a means of disrupting the current system and also resisting the current system. But I think the bigger picture for me is to understand actually how do we shift the culture, because the culture of surveillance, the culture of centralization and control is not limited to cash or Bitcoin or the financial system. It's a much bigger problem, and one that we won't be able to solve in the remaining minutes that we have on today's podcast. People always ask, what's the solution, Dan? What are we going to do? Well, the first thing we can do is get educated, which is why we created the Navigating the Digital Assets program. So for those of you who are keen to learn more, we're here live every single week. Not live necessarily, but we're here every week on the Uncharted Territory podcast. But we created a 3-part course where we walk through a lot of the things we talked about today, including the detachment from the gold standard. And in the first module, we talk about, that the ground level understanding of how the monetary system works and the basics, the good, the bad, and the ugly of the digital world of digital assets and blockchain, so that you can at least be informed. Because even if you choose not to hold Bitcoin or any other form of digital asset, it's better to understand what is happening with a nuanced and holistic view on it, rather than just simply shutting down because someone posted a comment in a chat room saying, we've got to preserve cash, and that blocks your ability to then go on and look at digital assets. So
you can preserve cash and diversify.
Exactly. You can preserve cash and learn more about other options, because the reality is central bank digital currencies in the way that they're being proposed, we've got to resist, but there is another way. And I think that's important now to realize that way has already been built, but it could easily be taken away if not enough people understand it or hold it. So,
and we always said, Dan, that people that don't never want people to fully understand what's going on, or the pros and cons and everything. That's a huge control mechanism in itself, isn't it? None of us were, I certainly wasn't brought up getting good financial education at school, and going on. And so they want us not to understand. That's the same with this whole shift and what's, the underlying take of Bitcoin and what's possible. And so that is a control mechanism itself, isn't it? Not having clarity, people not knowing the different options, and not even understanding the options they're in already, because we weren't educated. So that whole road of understanding the current monetary system, the alternatives, the different options, is a road to getting more empowered and improving your situation. And like you said, Dan, it's step by step. You don't need to jump into crypto or jump into this or that. You just need to improve where you're at, and that in its sense gives you more options and gives you more. It's just greater understanding what's going on. And I know the more you understand it, that's where the empowerment comes from.
Absolutely. So there's lots of ways you can get empowered and aware of these types of conversations. We're here every single week on the Uncharted Territory podcast, exploring these issues. If you like our way of dissecting what's happening in the world and you'd like to learn more, then Sam and I launched the Navigating Digital Assets program last year. Over 400 people now have taken that course to learn. In fact, over 500 now have learned the very basics and fundamentals of this new emerging world of digital assets, as well as all the ecosystem and tools that you need to enter into that market. If you'd like to find out more about that, you can go to weareelevate.org/digital assets. Both of us have got a long history of looking at these types of things in this type of way. So if you like our style and you'd like to learn from us, that's one way you can do that. But please do share this conversation. So we're recording this live right now, but it'll be broadcast on all of our major channels, YouTube, Rumble and Odyssey. We're launching very soon. You can also find us on Apple, Spotify, and every major audio platform. So Sam, as always, a brilliant conversation. And next up, we've got a conversation about Bitcoin explicitly. We're interviewing Jordan Walker from the Bitcoin Collective, who recently hosted Europe's largest Bitcoin conference. I'm really excited to meeting Jordan for the next episode.
Totally. I think it's going to be great to get an ethos and somebody who's been immersed in the kind of, the real core Bitcoin movement. I think that's really going to be really helpful for people to get a bigger understanding of the qualities and the ethos behind Bitcoin and what's possible in the possible future roadmap. So yeah, looking forward to that. Excellent.
So look us up on YouTube, on Apple, Spotify, subscribe on your favorite platform, and look out for the latest episode of the Uncharted Territory podcast. My name is Astin-Gregory. I've been here today, my co-host, Sam X. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you again on the next episode of the Uncharted Territory podcast.